The reluctant man too good at killing Alvin York when the United States entered the First World War. Many jumped at the opportunity to join the fighting. Others, however, were sent to the trenches against their will. Of these reluctant warriors, some would rise to the occasion and become war heroes, in spite of their hesitancy to fight. Perhaps the most famous American who served in the Great War was one of these men. Alvin Cullum York was born on December 13, 1887, in Pall Mall, Tennessee, the third of 11 children. His family was impoverished, and York only had 9 months of total formal schooling before working as a laborer and blacksmith to support his family. In order to put food on the table, he was also an avid hunter, a skill that would serve him well in the future. York also had a wild streak which included frequent run-ins with the law. By 1915, however, he turned aside from his hedonistic ways and became a member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union. After his conversion, York became a devout follower of his new faith and became a respected member of the church community. In 1917, the United States joined the First World War, which had been raging for 3 years. In order to fill the ranks quickly, the government instituted a draft, and on June 5, 1917, York received his conscription notification. Due to the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," York claimed conscientious objector status. This request was denied 3 times, and York was officially inducted into the U.S. Army. York was sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia, for training, and was attached to the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, nicknamed the All-American since it had members from all the 48 states at that time. Throughout his time in training, York proved himself a capable soldier and an excellent marksman, though he still couldn't reconcile his beliefs with the duties of a soldier. He brought his concerns to Major Edward Buxton, his battalion commander. Rather than dismiss York, Buxton engaged in an hours-long debate, both men pointing to Scripture supporting their views, York focusing on passages about turning the other cheek and other passages advocating nonviolence, while Buxton quoted verses supporting combat, selling one's cloak to buy a sword, and obedience to earthly authorities. York left the meeting still committed to his pacifism, but gave serious consideration to Buxton's arguments. While on leave, he prayed and fasted for guidance, and became convinced that he should do his duty and fight, regardless of his own personal misgivings. With a clear conscience, York and the 82nd Division were sent to France. Most notably, York participated in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which began on September 26, 1918, the largest single campaign ever conducted by the U.S. military, with over 1 million men participating over the course of the 47-day fight. After years of fighting, the Germans were highly experienced and built an elaborate network of defenses to hold the ground they had taken. The inexperienced Americans threw themselves into the meat grinder, and their attacks stalled out. On October 8, members of the 2nd Battalion, 328th Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, including newly promoted Corporal Alvin York, were sent to reinforce positions at Hill 223. Pushing against heavily entrenched Germans, they managed to force the Germans off of the hill, but to continue the advance, they would have to enter a steep valley with no discernible cover. To complicate matters further, the Americans on the left and right flanks were stalled out by stubborn resistance, leaving the battalion to advance alone. If that wasn't enough, the battalion was advancing to the northwest, though earlier that morning orders were changed, and they were supposed to attack due west. The runner carrying the order was killed before delivering the message, leaving the unit unsupported. York's platoon began their attack against the German lines, led by Lieutenant Kirby Stewart. As they reached the center of the valley, Stewart was hit by a burst of machine gun fire and killed, turning command over to Sergeant Harry Parsons. Parsons noted that on the left of their advance were German machine gun positions, and ordered 17 men, including Corporal Alvin York, to silence them. Making their way around the German positions, they stumbled upon elements of the Prussian 210th Reserve Infantry Regiment, which had been moved up as reinforcements. The Germans were resting after a forced march the night before and had set their weapons aside when confronted by the Americans. Caught off guard, the Germans surrendered. On a nearby hill, German machine gunners noticed what was happening and swung their weapons towards the Americans. They shouted for their countrymen to get down before unleashing a torrent of fire on the Americans, hitting both the doughboys as well as their fellow Germans. Of the 17 Americans, 6 were killed outright and 3 were wounded. While some of the remaining troops guarded the Pale-Pews, York was now the senior NCO of the remaining 8 that were capable of putting up resistance. York advanced to a better position about 50 yards from the Germans. Laying prone, York began to fire into the German machine gun crew and supporting riflemen. There is some controversy as to what rifle York used. Some suggest that he was armed with a Springfield 1903. Even his statue in Nashville, Tennessee, depicts him wielding this firearm. It was more likely, however, that he used a 1917 Enfield, a version of the British pattern 14 Enfield, which was modified to fire the .36 cartridge. These had been made by American firearm manufacturers for years for use by the British, and it was easier to convert these for American ammunition than to make enough 19.3s. Regardless of the type of rifle he wielded, he did so with devastating effect. Years of hunting experience made York adept under pressure, and he eliminated the machine gun crew and a number of riflemen with methodical efficiency. All the while, York repeatedly called out to the Germans to surrender, so he would not be forced to take any more lives. With the machine guns silenced, York made his way back downhill. As he walked, a group of Germans spotted him and launched a bayonet attack. York dropped his now empty rifle and drew his pistol, a Colt 1911. He stopped next to Private Percy Beardsley, the unit show shotgunner, who also drew his Colt and began firing on the charging Germans. Drawing on his knowledge gleaned from hunting turkeys, York aimed for the rearmost German first, the idea being that if the leader was dropped, the others would scatter and be more difficult to eliminate. Working his way from the back to the front, he methodically picked off the attackers one at a time, supported by Beardsley. Some of the Germans fell back in the confusion, but one by one they fell until the 6th was less than 10 feet away when hit. After seeing his countrymen being killed, a German officer among the POWs who spoke English approached York, and after a brief exchange said that he could get the remaining Germans to surrender. York agreed, and the officer blew a whistle and began shouting orders. York used him to translate instructions, and soon he, his surviving men, and a column of German POWs were on their way back to American lines. The group eventually arrived at a rear area when an officer approached York stating, "Well, York, I hear you've captured the whole German army." York replied, "No, sir. I only have 132. During his action in silencing the machine gun and stopping the bayonet attack, York killed 25 German soldiers. Due to this feat, York was promoted to sergeant and was given the Distinguished Service Cross. In April of 1919, a review of his actions had this award upgraded to the Medal of Honor. He would also be awarded the French Quadrille and several other foreign medals. After the war, York returned home to Tennessee and tried to reintegrate into the life that he had left behind. He did use his fame for charitable works, most of which focused on improving the lives of the residents of impoverished Appalachia. During the Second World War, York joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps as a major, though health complications prevented him from participating in any significant capacity. York would suffer a stroke in 1954 and spend the remaining decade of his life in failing health, passing away on September 2, 1964. Though hesitant to stay in the limelight, York did agree to have his tale told in a film. In 1941, Sergeant York was released in theaters, starring Hollywood legend Gary Cooper in the title role. One of the top-grossing movies of the era, and a film that would cement Alvin York's name in history. The medic who fought a war without a weapon, Desmond Doss, was not your average hero. He would become a Medal of Honor recipient, the United States of America's highest and most prestigious military award, as a combat medic who saved many of his comrades' lives in battle without firing a single shot, because he didn't take a weapon into combat because of his religious beliefs. Desmond Doss was born in 1919 in the state of Virginia and was raised as a strict Seventh-day Adventist, a Christian denomination that believed that Saturday was the Sabbath and that the second coming of Jesus Christ was imminent. They also believed strongly in nonviolence and a healthy diet, based typically on a vegetarian diet. Doss had been raised with a strict belief in the Bible, and when it came to the Ten Commandments, he took them to be the core values of how to lead his life. When World War II started, he was conflicted as he believed the war was a just one. But he felt that to kill another human being under any circumstance was wrong. He was already employed as a joiner at Newport News Naval Shipyard, but nevertheless he joined the United States Army on April 1, 1942. He could have requested a deferment, but he wanted to do his patriotic duty. He was assigned to an infantry unit, the 77th Division, and presumed that his classification as a conscientious objector would not require him to carry a weapon. For Doss, one commandment of the Bible stuck with him the most: "Thou shalt not kill." He wondered why he was assigned as a rifleman and not in a medical role. His commanding officer tried to pressure Doss into carrying a weapon, as they thought he would be more of a liability than an asset in combat, but Doss refused. Interestingly, even for medics, which Doss would later become, it was common practice at the time to carry either a 1911 pistol or one carbine for self-defense purposes. The rules go that a medic under the Geneva Convention is not forbidden from carrying a weapon, but if a medic fires his weapon, he stops being classed as a medic and therefore can be legitimately fired upon by the enemy. The regimental chaplain, Captain Stanley, would soon understand Doss's protests and helped him transfer from rifleman to medical training. To make matters worse, his fellow soldiers mocked his religious beliefs. When he was reading the Bible daily and strictly observing the Seventh-day Adventist tradition of attending church every Saturday, Doss continuously requested to be allowed to have Saturdays off rather than Sundays in order to follow his Adventist beliefs that Saturday was to be observed as the Sabbath. In the end, Captain Stanley took this up with divisional headquarters, and it was decided that Adventist soldiers would have Saturdays off, just as the other men had Sunday off. This, in fact, made Doss even more unpopular than ever with his fellow soldiers, as he was seen to have it easy. As he had Saturdays off, none were on base on Sundays to see him pull extra duties to make up for this. One of the squad's other soldiers summed up the company's feeling about him and his Saturdays off, complaining, "You get more passes than the general." As Doss was a strict vegetarian at a time when it was unusual, it meant that the rest of the unit viewed Doss with such distrust and hostility that one man in his unit even warned him ominously when we go into combat, "Doss, you're not coming back alive. I'm going to shoot you myself." Doss eventually became an Army combat medic, saying, "While others are taking life, I will be saving it. The turning point for Doss and his relationship with his company came with their first 25-mile march with full field pack and rifle, something they were expected to achieve in 8 hours. The other soldiers thought Doss would be having it easy, as he would be carrying no rifle or ammo that day, but his 2 canvas medical bags were almost as heavy and much more awkward to carry than any rifle. As the march progressed, the men started to suffer from exhaustion, numerous blistered feet, and dehydration. Some even passed out. And all the time there was Doss, always with a helping hand, even to the extent that at the end of the march he insisted on checking everyone's feet and administering medical aid where it was needed. By the end of that day, he had won the respect of his entire unit for his tireless devotion to his duty. For the first time, he was treated as one of their own. Doss, as the qualified combat medic of the unit, was now responsible for providing first aid and frontline trauma care on the battlefield. He would be assigned to accompany his unit into the war zone and be there with them on the front line at all times. This was soon to happen, for the 77th Division had had their first combat experience on May 11, 1943, and Doss and his comrades were urgently being trained up to replace the combat losses and help expand the division's strength. The 77th Division would end up being in combat officially for no less than 208 days, suffering a total of 9,212 casualties before the war would end. The Battle of Guam. Doss's first taste of combat was at the Battle of Guam, which was a bloody battle fought from July 21st to August 10th, 1944, to recapture the U.S. territory of the island of Guam from a determined Japanese garrison of nearly 20,000 troops. Though according to the Geneva Convention, knowingly firing at a medic wearing a clear insignia is a war crime, the Japanese snipers and machine gunners tended to ignore this and saw combat medics as easy and valuable targets to gun down. So medics in the Pacific Theater were often told to avoid wearing medical insignia in case it would make them more, not less, of a target. Doss was under fire nearly every day during the battle and was busy doing his part in saving lives. Guam had shown Doss how cruel war could be. As his unit was pushing forward through the jungle on their first day, a young, fresh-faced recruit spotted a fountain pen laying on the jungle floor and went to pick it up. Before anyone could warn him otherwise, a white phosphorus grenade exploded. The pen had been booby-trapped. The young man who had picked up the pen, his chest now a bloody mess, had blood pouring out of an open wound. Severe burns and sharp metal fragments covered his body, and he was going into shock. By some miracle, Doss managed to stabilize his condition, administering care and helping to evacuate him and 3 other soldiers who had been wounded by flying red-hot shrapnel. This was Doss's first taste of combat casualty. The U.S. casualties during the battle was truly appalling. Of the 59,000 U.S. troops who took part in the invasion, around everyone in 6 were either killed or wounded. The Battle of Leyte next. Doss and his unit was involved in the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines that ran from October 17th to December 26th, 1944. A vicious and prolonged battle which started with a huge U.S. coastal bombardment and amphibious landing, followed by heavy fighting the more inland the Americans went. During a Japanese counterattack, a fellow medic, Clarence Glenn, had heard the call for a medic from a machine gunner. He left the cover and went into the open, into no man's land, to get the wounded man, and was himself hit. Glenn was Doss's friend from back home, and he couldn't leave him there. So he and the litter bearer, Herb Schechter, went out to find the 2 wounded and dealt with them separately. Doss was attending the machine gunner who had a gash along his face while bullets whizzed overhead. Both of the wounded were alive. They made an improvised litter out of a poncho and tree branches to get the wounded men back to the aid station. But his friend Glenn would die before he made it. From this point on, Doss would not look at the face of the man he was treating in case it was another friend. Sadly, his friend Herb would be shot and killed when he and Doss were carrying a litter as their silhouette exposed them against the sky to the enemy. On top of losing his friends, Doss was constantly hungry because the meat in the K rations conflicted with his vegetarianism, so he could only eat the tasteless crackers and coconuts he found. On Lady, the coconuts on the ground gave him diarrhea, so he climbed the trees for fresh ones. At one point, Doss was looking for coconuts. It attracted poorly aimed Japanese machine gun fire. When they were killed by American soldiers, it was later discovered that they had been drunk on say. One thing that shocked Doss during the most devastating times of the campaign was that the same man who had made threats towards him during training at Fort Jackson now came to him for guidance and to pray for him. The Battle of Okinawa. And lastly, for Doss and the 77th Infantry Division, was a battle that was to be the bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific, as well as its largest amphibious landing. The U.S. objective was to secure the island as a base, as it was just 350 miles south of the Japanese mainland, and would be strategically crucial for any future invasion of Japan. The battle started on April 1st, 1945, exactly 3 years to the day that Doss first enlisted in the Army, and the battle was to last 81 days. Doss was assigned to the 1st Battalion as their combat medic. On April 29, 1945, the 77th Division was given the task of assaulting on a 400-foot high cliff called the Maida Escarpment. This was nicknamed by the Americans as Hacksaw Ridge. Before they climbed the cargo net, Doss said a prayer for his comrades. When Doss's unit joined the assault, and as they neared the top of the escarpment, they came under intense Japanese artillery, small arms and machine gun fire, inflicting severe casualties on the assaulting American troops. The American forces had sent in wave after wave of troops to try to dislodge a fanatical enemy base there who were well entrenched and camouflaged. On May 4th, while his unit was attacking a heavily fortified enemy position at the mouth of a cave, Doss went to the aid of 4 of his injured comrades. The lieutenant who led the attack on the emplacement had intended to throw a grenade when an enemy bullet hit him and delayed it, blowing his hand off and wounding his comrade. Despite having to get within 25 feet of the enemy lines and under attack by enemy grenades and gunfire, Doss managed to get to the injured men. He then managed to evacuate the men back to his own lines, one by one. During the night, the Japanese continued to throw grenades and kept up the mortar fire. The American soldiers hid in rock crevices, but the Japanese found ways to infiltrate and sneak up on them. Then on the next day, May 5th, he came to the rescue of a wounded artillery officer who had gone to see how the artillery guns were doing. Doss's left leg was now injured as he had fell the day before down the edge of a parapet. He climbed up the cargo net with his first aid kits, his weight falling on his bad leg. Finding him in a shell hole, the officer had been struck by a shrapnel that had made a hole from his chest to his back, and Doss could hear him breathing through. He was bleeding heavily. Doss gave him first aid while under constant enemy gunfire and shelling. He put the dressings over the large holes in the colonel's chest and back, and administered blood plasma, which dangerously exposed Doss to the enemy as he had to hold it up high. Doss's efforts here would be in vain as the colonel carried back on a stretcher died before he reached the aid station. Later, there were orders to take a vital Japanese pillbox position on the reverse slope of the hill that was holding up the American advance. Desmond Doss, once he had read his prayers, was happy to support the assault. The American troops threw gasoline cans at the position, which triggered a large explosion. All of a sudden, a large Japanese counterattack overwhelmed the American soldiers, causing them to panic and rush back to the edge of the cliff. But despite this, Doss refused to take cover, and while constantly under heavy fire by the enemy, though being totally exhausted, he spent hours carrying the wounded one by one to the edge of the escarpment. Then, to get the more severely wounded down, he tied a rope to a tree stump and lowered them down the cliff on a rope-supported stretcher to safety. When the stretcher kept slipping, he turned to a new method, looping the rope around the wounded men's chest and legs to lower them down. Doss, standing, exposed to potential enemy fire, was seen praying at the cliff edge as the men were being lowered down And later he had said he had been praying to the Lord to help him get one more, and after that, one more until they were all down. Calculating the wounded men at the base of the cliff, the captain worked out that Doss had saved around 75 men. The Americans would eventually go back up the cliff, and on May 7th would take the position. By some miracle, Doss survived the whole battle totally unhurt, but that was soon to change. On May 21st, in the confusion of a night attack, Doss tended to the American wounded, risking being hit by both the Japanese and by friendly fire. Doss was in a shell hole with another American soldier when a grenade landed beneath him. His reflex action was to put his foot on it and was seriously wounded in both legs. His blood poured out from the impact of 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body, but he remained in his position for 5 hours, tending to himself, while also helping others who were wounded, until a medic and a pair of litter-bearers could get to him. But that was not the end of it that day, for as he was being stretched to safety, they got caught in an enemy tank attack. As they took cover, Doss spotted a critically injured man and insisted that he be taken back on the stretcher instead of himself. While Doss waited for the litter-bearers to return, he was found and helped back by a fellow soldier. Suddenly, Doss was hit by a Japanese sniper's bullet and suffered a compound fracture to his arm. The two men took cover in a shell hole. Realizing how badly injured he now was, Doss instructed the soldier on how to bind his rifle stock to his shattered arm to act as a splint. Eventually, pushing through excruciating pain, he would make it back to the aid station. The U.S. Army recognized Doss's extreme bravery, and he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic and selfless actions at Okinawa. From April 29th to May 21st, 1945. Because of his heroic actions, many wounded men made it back home. Desmond Doss would go on to run a small family farm with his wife Dorothy and lived to the age of 87. The World War I Crucifixion 1915. World War I ran from 1914 to 1918 and was one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. It was also one of the most brutal, employing the very latest high-tech weapons capable of lethal destruction, such as tanks, deadly poison gas rapid-firing machine guns that could fire as many as 10 rounds per second, and giant railway guns that could fire a 2-ton shell over a distance of more than 10 miles. Also, for the very first time ever, there were massive aerial dogfights that took place thousands of feet above the ground in flimsy planes made of just canvas and wood. It got shot down. The pilots faced certain death, as parachutes were not yet standard issue at this time. The war on the Western Front quickly descended into harsh and brutal trench warfare. This started a devastating cycle of death and destruction, resulting in a seemingly never-ending series of attack and counterattack across no man's land by both sides. This always seemed to achieve very little, until this vicious stalemate was finally broken in 1918, when the Allies broke through the German lines and quickly brought the war to an end. Early on in the conflict, facts, hearsay, and propaganda started to get mixed up together on both the front line and the home fronts. For instance, right at the beginning of the war, there emerged fantasy accounts of supernatural angels or phantom bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt of 1415, supposedly protecting the British Army from defeat at the Battle of Mons that took place in Belgium around August 23, 1914. Nevertheless, despite being untrue, this was used as great propaganda by the British, claiming that it clearly showed that God was on their side against the evil of the Imperial German Empire. Then, a short time later, amid all the chaos of combat on the Western Front, stories started to emerge of the inhumane treatment of a captured Canadian soldier. These stories both shocked and angered the Allied forces and public alike. It concerned the supposed crucifixion of a Canadian prisoner at the hands of his German captors. The rumors surrounding this gruesome event were vague, and the details kept changing, depending on where and from who you heard it from. Nevertheless, a horrifying account of this event was featured on the highly respected British Times newspaper on May 10, 1915. It was claimed that a captured Canadian officer near the battlefield of Ypres in Belgium was crucified with bayonets by the Germans. It was said that they used them to pin him against a barn door or tree, one in each arm and leg, and that he was finished off by having a final bayonet driven through his throat. It was also alleged that the Germans finally riddled his body with bullets. This atrocity caused such an outcry among the British public that 2 days later questions were asked about it in the Houses of Parliament, and it was now thought the actual number of Canadian prisoners that were crucified could be as high as 3. The British government responded by stating that at the present time they had no information about these atrocities, but promised that the War Office would look into these claims as a matter of urgency. Meanwhile, the Times published a follow-up article claiming they had witnesses to the event, and the man who was crucified was in fact an unnamed sergeant in the Canadian Army. Then on May 19th, in the Houses of Parliament, the Conservative MP Sir Robert Houston raised further concerns surrounding the supposed crucifixion of a captured Canadian soldier. He declared he had come across more detailed information about the incident. He said he had heard from unnamed witnesses that the unnamed sergeant was the only survivor of 40 captured wounded Canadian soldiers who were bayoneted to death in a barn by the Germans. The Canadian sergeant was then tied to the village's large public crucifix, having first removed the figure of Christ from it. It was then alleged that he too was bayoneted to death. Another version stated that the victim was identified as Sergeant Thomas Elliott of the Canadian Medical Service, who came from Brantford in Ontario, Canada, but he later wrote to his pastor saying that he was definitely not the man involved. The British Under-Secretary of State for War responded by making it clear all alleged war crimes were taken seriously and thoroughly investigated, adding that this particular incident had yet to be authenticated and that inquiries were still going on. There emerged several other versions of the same story, some saying the soldier was, in fact, British, and some said he was nailed or fastened to the side of a barn or to a tree. At this time, Allied soldiers would have also witnessed something quite barbaric behind their own lines. After flogging was abolished in the British Army in 1881, an alternative was introduced and known as Field Punishment No. 1. This was awarded for drunkenness in the field and insubordination, and involved being tied to a wagon wheel or a gate in the crucifixion pose. The victim would be shackled like this for 2 hours a day for up to 3 out of 4 days of a sentence. In total, the British Army carried out this punishment 60,120 times during World War I. Though the story of the crucifixion was never substantiated, it was nevertheless used by the British for propaganda purposes and to get support from across the world. The U.S. authorities even used the gruesome tale to sell its Liberty War bonds. After the war, the myth continued. In 1918, a 32-inch high or 810-millimeter bronze sculpture was created by Francis Derwent Wood. It was named Canada's Golgotha and depicted the same supposed crucifixion of a Canadian soldier nailed to a barn door at the hands of his German captors, who jeer at him. The sculpture was to be revealed in January 1919 at an exhibition at Burlington House, London. In fact, before the statue was even on show, The public were aware of it. It had been widely publicized, having been featured in a publicity package sent out by the Canadian War Records Office. The Daily Mail newspaper captioned it Canada's sternest memorial to her sons suffering in the war. All of this was during the same month as the Paris Peace Conference and the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty. The crucified soldier sculpture was going to cause a stir for those at the Versailles Conference and for those seeking a peaceful solution. Canadian Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden led an investigation into the war crime story. The German government at the same time demanded that the Canadians publicly admit that the story of the crucified soldier was untrue or provide evidence. The Canadian government believed that they had two accounts to verify the story, one of those being from a victim called Sergeant Brandt. The crucified soldier sculpture was withdrawn from the exhibition, however, when the Germans demanded to take part in the investigation. Being investigated by the losers of the war must have caused a lot of embarrassment for the Canadian government. The sculpture would never be shown again until the 1990s. After taking the sculpture down in 1919, Canadians continued to look into the story but could not find any proof that it had happened. The Nazis would use the crucified soldier years later as an example of Britain and its Commonwealth's propaganda.